13. Magical Talismanology. In Part 1 of this book, short instructions for the charge of talismans and amulets were given together with hints for their practical application. It seems, however, necessary to remind the reader of a few instructions here, adding to them others which may be new to the magician. In this last chapter I have decided to write about talismanic magic and those details which have to be considered. Much has already been written about talismans, yet much more could be said about it from the hermetic point of view, though I must cut short here for technical reasons. The experienced magician will find everything that is said about this theme familiar and understandable. Looking at it from the hermetic point of view, a talisman is the means, the medium or material shape by which a force, a faculty, a power, an influence, etc. can be bound. There are various ways for binding such a force. But first a few words about talismans. The magician has learned how to get into contact with a being, an intelligence, a genius, etc. He has been shown the 4 possible ways: 1. Mental traveling, 2. Evocation, 3. Passive intercourse as described in the book Initiation into Hermetics in the chapter dealing with Spiritism, and 4. Talismans. As for the shape of the talisman, it can be a piece of jewelry, a ring, a stone, an amulet, a locket, etc. But also other forms may be chosen for talismans. The ones stated above are, however, the usual types. The best way for the magician to go about it is to manufacture the talisman by himself alone, right from the beginning, i.e., from its fluid state, as molten metal, up to its charging. If this is not possible, if the magician lacks the necessary skill, etc., he should have the talisman manufactured by someone else, but only in its basic, its raw shape. After the talisman has been brought into its intended shape, the magician starts with the actual talismanic magic by making a genuine talisman, a genuine medium, out of it. The seal of the intelligence whom the magician wants to get into contact with is engraved upon the metal. If the magician cannot do this himself, he can have it done by a conscientious engraver or goldsmith. The object to be used as talisman or amulet is now ready to be magically impregnated. The magician may also, if he wants, take into consideration the astrological signature when preparing, respectively impregnating, the talisman. The wealth of existing astrological literature will make it easy for him to work out favorable stars' influences. When choosing the metal for the talisman, the astrological analogy of the relevant zodiacal sign has to be considered. Since the zodiacal signs were also mentioned in the chapter dealing with the hierarchy of the spheres, it will be easy to choose the kind of metal that is appropriate to their zodiacal sign of the genius that has been selected by the magician. But it is also possible to choose metals in analogy to the planetary spheres, see table below. The best metal one can use for the beings, genii and intelligences of all the spheres is the so-called electromagicum, an alloy of the metals that are appropriate to all the planets as described in the author's first book Initiation into Hermetics, in the chapters dealing with fluid condensers. Such an alloy is best suited for the beings of the zone girdling the earth and for the beings of the elements in the kingdom of elements. But also wood, hardwood, or lead may be used for the zone girdling the earth. Regarding the moon sphere and its 28 intelligences, silver should be used for producing the talisman. This is done in accordance with the planetary laws of analogy. For the Mercury zone use brass, for the Venus sphere copper, for the Sun sphere gold, for the Mars sphere iron, for the Jupiter sphere tin, for the Saturn sphere lead, for the other spheres tin or silver may be used. The analogies given above in respect of the metals to be chosen for the production of talismans are of a general nature. They are only to be taken into consideration by the magician who wants to work with astrological analogies. The well-trained and experienced magician will, in general, find 2 types of metal sufficient, i.e., he will use gold for beings of prevailing electric character and silver for beings of magnetic character. He uses both metals for neutral beings, for beings that are neither active nor passive, that neither have an electric nor a magnetic fluid. In this case, 2 small plates, equal in size, one made of gold the other made of silver, have to be soldered together, so that one side of the talisman is of gold, the other of silver, if the talisman has, for example, the shape of a pendant. However, for a good initiate and an experienced sphere magician, the question of choosing the right type of metal is of minor importance. He is able to impregnate magically and successfully any object with an intelligence of any sphere, since the magical contact and the impregnation of the objects the magician chooses depend on his magical development and maturity. Adepts usually have only one favorite metal which they prefer for the charging with intelligences. They use pure gold. But, of course, this is not really necessary. Any common kind of talisman, with a perfect magical impregnation, does the same duty as the one produced of pure gold or jewels. The next thing the magician has to do is to carry out the magical impregnation of the talisman. This is the most important work when charging a talisman, for it is by this act that the talisman becomes the appropriate implement for getting into contact with the being or intelligence the magician has in mind. Below, the magician will find a specimen of the procedure for carrying out a magical impregnation. After having chosen the being, genius or intelligence that seems to suit his purposes due to its magical or other qualities, it is best to start with a being of the zone girdling the earth, and after having engraved its seal upon the metal chosen for this purpose, the magician has to free the talisman by the four elements from all unfavorable influences which have mentally clung to it when it was materially formed into shape. This is done by swinging the talisman a few times over a burning candle with the imagination that the flame burns away, i.e., destroys, all that negative influences. Moreover, the talisman has to be dipped into a glass filled with pure water where it has to remain for a whole day, the magician having concentrated on the wish that the water may draw out of it any bad influences. After a day, the magician takes the talisman out of the water again, throwing the latter away with the imaginative wish that all the unfavorable influences will flow away with it. Now he swings the talisman through the air in rotary motions, concentrating on the imagination that also the element of the air will take away all negative influences from the talisman. Then the magician puts a handful of earth into a piece of filter paper. After having added the talisman to it, he rolls it together, so that he can hold it in his hand. Now he must concentrate on the idea that also the element of the earth, which now surrounds the talisman, will tear away from it all negative influences that might still cling to it. After the magician has concentrated deeply enough and come to the conviction that the last unfavorable influences have been pulled out of the talisman by the element of the earth, he takes the talisman out of the earth, cleans it with a piece of cloth that has never been used before and wraps it into a piece of dark violet silk. The filter paper and the earth that was used for this operation must then be buried away in a place that is not easily accessible. During this procedure the talisman has been cleaned, from the hermetic point of view, by help of the elements. This means that no element clings to it any longer, and that therefore no element will influence its charge. If the magician wants to include astrological aspects, he will keep the talisman in the dark violet silk till the astrological hour approaches. When that hour has come, he will carry out the charge of the talisman. He will redraw the engraved seal with a new needle, concentrating on the wish that by this redrawing he bands the being's interests or attention into the object before him. During this procedure the magician can, again and again, repeat in his mind the name of the intelligence in question and imagine that the intelligence is transferring, at that moment, its influence to the talisman. The physical preparations, the getting into contact as it is called from the hermetic point of view, have now come to an end. The first step of magic impregnation has been done. Now there exist many possibilities of charge. The most effective way of charge is carried out by evocation, i.e., by summoning the intelligence before the magic circle by appropriate rituals and by asking it to approve of the talisman lying in or before the magic circle, i.e., to promise the bearer of the talisman to assist him at any time. If the intelligence gives the promise of doing the bearer of the talisman this favor, the magician has achieved what he wanted and the talisman has thus been charged. However, the magician must make sure that before using the talisman he takes all the measures that the intelligence might have recommended him. For the intelligence may, for example, Take precautions by asking the bearer of the talisman to do some kind of ritual with it every day, to speak certain formulae over the talisman, or to draw certain signs with it, or to name certain names necessary for the maintenance of the talisman, or to keep certain things a secret, and so forth. If everything necessary was taken into consideration when the talisman was charged, its bearer can achieve the same effects with it as Lai could do by personal contacts which he might have started by mental traveling or evocation. The above way of charging a talisman is one of the most effective methods in talismanic impregnation for getting into contact with a certain intelligence. But it usually happens that the intelligence in question, when this method is used for getting into contact with it, only sends its subordinated servants to have them bound to the talisman and their names revealed to the bearer. The desired effects are afterwards brought about by them whenever their names are pronounced or a certain concerted signal is given. Another way for impregnating a talisman is as follows. The contact with the intelligence is taken up by repeated imagination of its qualities. The magician has to concentrate these qualities into the metal. He has to keep in mind that in this case time, space and effects are terminated. This method of impregnation makes it necessary for the magician to have imperturbable confidence, and he must, furthermore, have sufficient magic power to force the intelligence to do his will, i.e., to bring about the desired effects. Another possibility is to carry out the impregnation by the help of a ritual. This is done by drawing the intelligence's seal in the air with the talisman in hand and by concentrating on the realization of the effects that are to be brought about. The quabbalist, however, is aware of the fact that such a ritual would have to be repeated at least 462 times before the desired contact is effected and the talisman really becomes magically efficacious. The next method for impregnation is the so-called charge with magic volts, using, for this purpose, the electromagnetic fluid. The volt is charged, after its creation, with an electromagnetic fluid. The qualities of the intelligence in question are concentrated into the center of the volt by help of imagination, imperturbable confidence and sure power, and are so condensed by repeated action that the metal of the talisman absorbs the volt. When the process of charging by volts is repeated, the magician has to concentrate on the wish that the intelligence in question is connected to that particular volt and that it will bring about by it the desired causes in the Akasha world, and with them the desired effects. There is another way of charging a talisman, the one by sexual magic. But to avoid a misuse, this method is not dealt with in detail here. The magician who has been initiated into the high mysteries and to whom, therefore, everything is clean and sacred, will, no doubt, know how the plus and minus in man and woman can be used for the magical impregnation of a talisman by the help of volts. The quabbalistic method is the last possible way for impregnating a talisman. The magician who has been initiated into Quabbala may avail himself of this method. He pronounces the name of the intelligence in question quabbalistically over the talisman that has been prepared to be charged. By this action the intelligence's qualities are transferred into the talisman. The details of such a magic quabbalistic charge of a talisman will be known to every initiate who has followed all the instructions up to this point and who has learned to get into contact with any intelligence, no matter to whatever sphere it may belong, providing that he was taught by some intelligences about the Quabbala. My third book, entitled The Key to the True Quabbala, will, however, give the reader the details in this respect. So much about the impregnation and charge of talismans, and the basis of magical talismanology. The mature reader will find this information sufficient. To the immature ones this science will have remained a secret.